Turning 27 felt like some kind of checkpoint I was not ready for, and my co-workers at the dental office where I worked as a hygienist threw me a small party in the break room that March of 2024. I had been single for almost 2 years at that point, not really looking but not opposed to meeting someone either. My life in Raleigh, North Carolina revolved around work, my 2 cats, and the occasional weekend trip to visit my mom a couple hours away. I lived in a ground-floor apartment in a quiet complex near a strip mall, the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely but rarely spoke. One of the other hygienists, a woman named Faye who had become something like a best friend over the years, convinced me to download a dating app during our lunch break. She sat there watching me swipe through profiles, laughing at the bad ones, pointing out the ones she thought had potential. That afternoon I matched with a guy named Trevor Ashby, and Faye practically cheered when she saw his photos. He had kind eyes, a decent smile, and his bio mentioned he loved cooking and rescue dogs. We went on 4 dates over the next 3 weeks, and he was pleasant enough. Coffee near a bookstore, a walk through a park downtown, dinner at an Italian place he picked, and one night at his apartment where he cooked me pasta and we talked for hours. Trevor worked as some kind of database administrator, lived alone in a rented house about 20 minutes from my complex, and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. He remembered that I preferred iced coffee even when it was cold outside, that my older cat was named Benson, that I had a complicated relationship with my father. But something about him made me uneasy in a way I could not quite name. He texted constantly, sometimes sending 4 or 5 messages before I could respond to the first one. He asked detailed questions about my schedule, my routine, where I shopped for groceries. After that 4th date, I knew I needed to end things before they went any further. I sent him a text on a Sunday afternoon, thanking him for the time we spent together but explaining I did not feel a romantic connection. His reply came almost instantly, just a single word: okay. No argument, no pushback, nothing. I thought I had handled it well. I thought he understood. The first sign that something was wrong came about 2 weeks later. I was grabbing lunch at a sandwich shop I went to almost every Friday, a little place in a plaza near my office, when I spotted Trevor sitting at a corner table. He was just staring at me, not eating, not looking at his phone, just watching. When our eyes met, he smiled and gave me a small wave like we were old friends running into each other by coincidence. I waved back awkwardly, grabbed my order, and left as fast as I could without making it obvious I was rushing. I told myself it was nothing, that Raleigh was not that big and people crossed paths sometimes. But then it happened again 3 days later at the grocery store I always went to on Monday evenings. He was standing at the end of an aisle, pretending to look at cereal boxes, but I could feel his eyes following me as I moved through the store. I abandoned my cart and drove home with my heart pounding in my chest. That night I double-checked every lock on my doors and windows before I could even think about sleeping. Faye was the first person I told, and she took it seriously right away. She asked if I had kept any of his messages, if I knew his full address, if I had told anyone else. I showed her my phone, and that is when I realized he had been texting me again. Not anything threatening, just casual messages asking how I was doing, if I had tried that new coffee place downtown, if Benson was feeling better after his vet appointment. The thing is, I had never told him Benson was sick. I had posted about it on my private Instagram account the week before, the one I thought was locked down to only close friends. Faye scrolled through my followers list and found him there, a profile with no photo, and a generic username that I must have accepted without thinking months ago. He had been watching everything I posted, every story, every photo, every location tag. Faye grabbed my hand and looked me dead in the eyes and told me this was not normal, that this was stalking, and that I needed to document everything starting now. I wanted to believe she was overreacting, but somewhere deep in my gut I knew she was right. I blocked him on everything that same night. Instagram, the dating app, his phone number, even his email address that I found buried in an old message thread. For a few days things went quiet, and I started to let myself breathe again. Then the messages started coming from new numbers, different area codes, always the same tone. He would ask why I was ignoring him, say he just wanted to talk, insist that we had something special and I was throwing it away. One message said he drove by my apartment and noticed I had left my living room light on all night, asked if I was having trouble sleeping. That one made me sick to my stomach. I started parking in different spots, taking alternate routes to work, checking my rearview mirror constantly. My mom could tell something was wrong when I called her that weekend, and when I finally explained the situation, her voice went sharp with fear. She wanted me to come stay with her, to call the police, to do something. But I kept thinking about all the stories I had heard where women reported stalkers, and nothing happened until it was too late. I went to the police station on a Saturday morning, bringing printed screenshots of every message, every sighting, every piece of evidence I had collected. The officer who took my report was a heavy-set man in his 50s who listened with a tired expression that told me he had heard versions of this story 100 times before. He explained that unless Trevor made an explicit threat or physically harmed me, there was not much they could do. He suggested I vary my routine, stay aware of my surroundings, maybe look into a restraining order if things escalated. I asked him what counted as escalation, and he just shrugged and said I would know it when I saw it. Walking out of that station, I felt more alone than I had in years. The system that was supposed to protect me had essentially told me to wait until something terrible happened before they could help. I sat in my car in that parking lot and cried until I could not breathe. Then I wiped my face and drove to Faye's house because I could not stand the thought of being alone in my apartment. Faye lived in a small ranch-style house in a neighborhood about 15 minutes from the dental office. She had bought the place 2 years earlier, after her divorce, and it had become a second home to me during all those late nights when we would drink wine and complain about difficult patients. That Saturday afternoon, she met me at the door before I even knocked, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. I told her everything about the police visit, about the officer's shrug, about feeling like I was screaming into a void. She made me tea and sat across from me at her kitchen table, and together we came up with a plan. I would stay with her for a while, just until things calmed down. I would keep documenting everything. We would look into hiring a lawyer, maybe pursue a civil restraining order since the criminal route seemed useless. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over my own life again. Faye's house felt safe, tucked away on a quiet street lined with old oak trees, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. I went back to my apartment that Sunday to pack a bag and grab some things for the cats. The plan was to bring Benson and my younger cat Noodle to stay at Faye's until I figured out my next move. When I pulled into my parking spot, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My chest tightened as I reached for it, already knowing who it was from. The handwriting was neat, almost careful, and the message was short. It said he knew I was scared, but that I did not need to be, that he would never hurt me, that we were meant to be together and eventually I would see that. He signed it with a small heart next to his name. I looked around the parking lot, scanning every car, every shadow, every window in the building surrounding mine. He could have been anywhere. He could have been watching me read his words at that very moment. I grabbed the note with shaking fingers, shoved it in my pocket, and practically ran to my apartment. I packed everything in under 20 minutes, stuffed both cats into their carriers despite their protests, and drove to Faye's house without stopping once. 3 days passed at Faye's place without incident, and I started to wonder if maybe the distance had finally made him lose interest. I kept going to work, kept documenting every unknown number that called, kept my head on a swivel whenever I walked to my car. Faye had installed a doorbell camera the year before, and we checked the footage religiously every evening, but it only ever showed delivery drivers and the occasional stray cat wandering through her yard. On the fourth night, a Wednesday, Faye had to work a late shift covering for another hygienist who called in sick. She told me to lock up tight, keep my phone charged, and call her if anything seemed strange. I made myself dinner, watched some mindless reality show on her couch, and tried to convince myself that this whole nightmare was finally winding down. Around 9 that evening, I took Benson and Noodle into the guest bedroom and settled in for an early night. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, how grateful I was to have a friend like Faye, who would open her home to me without hesitation. I woke up sometime after 11 to the sound of knocking. Not loud or aggressive, just 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. There were no missed calls, no messages from Faye saying she was coming home early. I pulled up the doorbell camera app with trembling fingers and felt my entire body go cold when I saw who was standing on the porch. Trevor was looking directly into the camera, his face illuminated by the porch light, wearing that same calm smile he had given me at the sandwich shop weeks ago. He knocked again, 3 more slow taps, then leaned close to the camera and said my name. He said he knew I was inside, that he had followed me from my apartment days ago, that he just wanted to talk. His voice was soft, almost gentle, like he was coaxing a frightened animal out of hiding. I watched him through the screen as he tilted his head and asked why I was making this so difficult, why I could not just give us a real chance. I texted Faye with fingers that could barely hit the right keys, telling her he was here, begging her to call the police. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Trevor stood on the porch, occasionally glancing around the yard, checking his phone, acting like he had all the time in the world. I had moved into the hallway, crouched between the bathroom and the guest bedroom, trying to make myself as small as possible while keeping my eyes locked on the camera feed. Then I heard him walk off the porch, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led around the side of the house. I switched to the backyard camera and watched him approach the sliding glass door that opened into Faye's kitchen. He tested the handle, found it locked, and stood there for a moment with his hands pressed flat against the glass. The way he stared into the dark house made my skin prickle with a fear I had never felt before in my life. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, and I realized with horror that it was a small crowbar. The sound of metal against the door frame was loud enough to echo through the whole house. I called 911 with shaking hands, whispering my location and the situation to the dispatcher, who told me to stay hidden and that officers were on their way. I heard the glass shatter, heard his footsteps on the kitchen tile, heard him call my name again like we were playing some twisted game of hide and seek. I locked myself in the bathroom at the end of the hall, pressing my back against the door, clutching a pair of scissors I had grabbed from Faye's desk. His footsteps moved through the house slowly, methodically, opening doors and closing them one by one. He kept talking the whole time, his voice eerily calm, saying things like he forgave me for running, that he understood I was confused, that once we talked everything would make sense. When he reached the bathroom door, he knocked softly, the same 3 slow taps from before. He said my name and asked me to open up, promised he would not hurt me, said he just needed to see my face. I told him through the door that the police were coming, that he needed to leave now if he knew what was good for him. He laughed, a quiet sound that carried no humor at all, and said he did not care about the police, that they could not keep us apart. I heard him grip the doorknob, felt the door shudder as he put his weight against it. The wood around the lock started to splinter. I was screaming at that point, screaming for help, screaming for anyone to hear me. And then, like some kind of miracle, I heard sirens in the distance growing louder and louder. Trevor went silent. His footsteps retreated quickly down the hall, and I heard the back door slam. I stayed pressed against that bathroom door, scissors raised, until I heard officers announcing themselves inside the house. They caught Trevor 2 blocks away, running through someone's backyard with the crowbar still in his hand. He was arrested that night and charged with breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. Faye arrived at her house 20 minutes after the police, and she held me on her front lawn while I sobbed into her shoulder. The restraining order I filed the next day was granted immediately, and Trevor's bail was set high enough that he sat in county jail for 3 months awaiting trial. He eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received 18 months in prison plus mandatory psychological evaluation. I moved out of my apartment and into a new place across town, somewhere he had never seen, somewhere I could start over. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media, and spent months in therapy trying to untangle the fear that had wound itself around every part of my daily life. Faye still checks in on me almost every day, and my mom drove down to stay with me for the first few weeks after everything happened. It has been almost 8 months now, and I still double-check my locks every night, still look twice at every car parked near my building, still feel a jolt of panic whenever someone knocks on my door unexpectedly. I know Trevor will be released eventually, and that thought sits in the back of my mind like a stone I cannot swallow. But I also know that I did everything right, that I trusted my instincts, that I leaned on the people who loved me when I needed them most. If you're reading this and something similar is happening to you, please listen to me. Document everything. Tell everyone you trust, and never let anyone make you feel crazy for being afraid. Your fear is valid, your safety matters, and you deserve to be believed. Heather and I had been sharing an apartment in Tucson for almost 3 years when it happened. She was a medical transcriptionist who worked from home, spending long hours alone in our converted second bedroom with her headphones on, typing reports while I sat in a gray cubicle across town crunching numbers at an accounting firm. We had met at a friend's barbecue the summer after I graduated college in 2015, and something just clicked between us. She had this quiet intensity about her, a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. I used to find that attractive. Now I understand it differently. Now I see how little I actually knew about what went on inside her head during all those silent hours, how the isolation of her job had been doing something to her, that I was too busy, too comfortable, too stupid to notice. October of 2022 started like any other month. Work was picking up as we headed toward the end of the fiscal year, and I found myself staying late more often than usual. One of the senior partners announced his retirement, and on that particular night, the whole office gathered at a bar downtown to celebrate. I texted Heather around 7 to say I would be home late. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji, nothing more. At the time, I appreciated how low maintenance she was, how she never guilt-tripped me or demanded constant updates on my whereabouts. That felt like trust. That felt like a healthy relationship. By the time I stumbled into an Uber around midnight, my head was fuzzy with beer, and my thoughts had already drifted to lazy weekend plans. Brunch at that new place she wanted to try. Maybe finally starting the puzzle her mom gave us last Christmas. Normal things. Safe things. I had no idea what was waiting for me in our dark apartment. When the driver pulled up to our building, I noticed that every window in our unit was completely dark. That was unusual because Heather always left the kitchen light on when she knew I would be coming home late. She said she liked the idea of me walking into something warm and welcoming rather than a pitch-black apartment. I figured she had just forgotten, or maybe fallen asleep early. The building was quiet as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The kind of thick silence that only exists after midnight in residential neighborhoods. Our door was locked, which was normal, and I let myself in as quietly as I could, not wanting to wake her. The living room was empty, the television off, and I could see a thin strip of pale moonlight cutting across the hallway floor from our bedroom. I slipped off my shoes by the door and padded toward the bedroom, already loosening my tie. I pushed open the bedroom door, expecting to find Heather asleep, maybe curled up on her side the way she usually slept. Instead, she was sitting upright in bed, perfectly still, facing the doorway. The moonlight coming through the blinds fell across her in broken stripes, and I could see her eyes were wide open, fixed directly on me. She did not say hello. She did not move. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, watching me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something flatter, emptier, like she was looking at a stranger who had wandered into the wrong apartment. My first instinct was to ask if she was okay, if she had a nightmare, or could not sleep. But something about the way she held herself, that rigid stillness, made the words catch in my throat. The room felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the apartment. I asked her what was wrong, keeping my voice soft, the way you might talk to a scared animal. She did not answer right away. For maybe 5 or 6 seconds, she just continued staring at me, and I became acutely aware of how loud my own breathing sounded in that silence. Then she spoke, and her voice came out flat and measured, almost robotic. She asked me who I had been with tonight. I told her about the retirement party, the same thing I had texted her earlier, but she shook her head slowly like I was lying. She said she knew I was with someone else, that she had been thinking about it all night, running through the evidence in her head. I tried to laugh it off, told her she was being ridiculous, that she could check my phone if she wanted. But she did not reach for my phone. She just kept staring with those hollow eyes, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was not a normal bout of jealousy. Something had broken inside her while I was gone. I decided the best thing to do was to get into bed and let her calm down. Maybe she would feel better in the morning after some sleep, and we could talk about whatever was bothering her like rational adults. I walked around to my side of the bed, pulled back the covers, and sat down on the edge of the mattress to take off my socks. That is when I noticed her right hand had moved from her lap to somewhere beneath her pillow. I asked her what she had under there, trying to keep my tone casual even though my heart had started hammering in my chest. She said it was nothing, but the way her fingers curled around something out of sight, the way her whole body seemed to tense like a coiled spring, told me it was definitely not nothing. I asked her again, firmer this time, and she pulled her hand out slowly. In her grip was a kitchen knife, the big one we used for chopping vegetables, the blade catching the moonlight in a way that made my entire body go rigid. I raised both hands in front of me, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say, what to do, how to get that knife away from her without making things worse. I called her name softly, told her she was scaring me, asked her to please put the knife down so we could talk. She tilted her head to one side like a curious bird, studying me with that same empty expression. Then she said something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. She said she had been watching me sleep for the past few weeks, standing over the bed in the dark, trying to decide what to do about me. She said she had seen the signs, the way I looked at my phone, the way I smiled at texts I thought she could not see. None of it was true, but in her mind she had constructed an entire alternate reality where I was the villain of her story. I started to inch backward off the bed, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, never breaking eye contact with her. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt for the door and get out of that apartment as fast as my legs could carry me. But I also knew that sudden movements might trigger something, might push her over whatever edge she was balanced on. She watched me move with those unblinking eyes, the knife still clutched in her fist, and I could see a vein pulsing in her neck. When my feet touched the floor on the far side of the bed, I told her I was going to get her some water, that maybe she was dehydrated or having some kind of episode. I took one step toward the door. That was when she lunged. She came across the bed faster than I would have thought possible, the knife slashing through the air in a wide arc aimed directly at my chest. I threw myself backward and felt the blade whistle past my face, missing my throat by what could not have been more than an inch. I crashed into the dresser behind me, knocking over a lamp and a framed photo of us from happier times. The glass shattered against the floor, and for a split second I thought about grabbing a shard to defend myself, but there was no time. Heather was already coming at me again, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette being controlled by someone who did not quite know how the strings worked. I managed to grab her wrist as she swung the knife down toward my shoulder, and we struggled there in the darkness, her breath hot against my face, her eyes wild with something I can only describe as complete disconnection from reality. She was stronger than I expected, fueled by whatever storm was raging inside her head, and I could feel my grip slipping as she twisted and thrashed. I screamed her name over and over, begging her to stop, to come back to me, but it was like talking to a wall. The woman I loved was gone, replaced by something I did not recognize. I finally managed to twist her arm at an angle that forced her to drop the knife. It clattered to the floor somewhere in the darkness, and I kicked it away as hard as I could, hearing it skid across the hardwood and disappear under the bed. But even without the weapon, she did not stop. She clawed at my face, my arms, my chest, her fingernails raking deep grooves into my skin. I had no choice but to wrap my arms around her and pin her against me, holding her as tight as I could, while she screamed and thrashed and called me names I had never heard her use before. She accused me of poisoning her, of putting cameras in the walls, of working with her co-workers to ruin her life. None of it made sense. All of it terrified me. I held her like that for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, until finally, her body went limp, and she started to sob against my chest like a child waking from a nightmare. I called 911 with one hand while keeping my other arm wrapped around her. The dispatcher asked me a series of questions I could barely process, my voice shaking as I tried to explain that my girlfriend had just tried to kill me, but that I thought she was having some kind of mental breakdown. They sent police and paramedics, and I sat there on the bedroom floor with Heather crying in my arms, blood trickling down my face from where her nails had torn my skin, waiting for help to arrive. She kept mumbling apologies between sobs, saying she did not know what happened, that she had been so scared, that she thought I was going to hurt her first. I wanted to be angry. Part of me was angry, furious even, at how close I had come to dying in my own bedroom at the hands of someone I trusted completely. But mostly, I just felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left only a shell sitting there on that cold floor. The paramedics took Heather to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation, and I spent the next several hours at the police station giving my statement. The officers were surprisingly kind, one of them a woman named Tara, who brought me coffee and told me her brother had gone through something similar with his wife years ago. When I finally got back to the apartment the next morning, the sun was already up, and everything looked so painfully normal in the daylight. The broken lamp, the scattered glass, the scratch marks on my arms, those were the only evidence that anything had happened at all. I found the knife under the bed where I had kicked it, and I just stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile that ordinary kitchen utensil with the weapon that had nearly ended my life. I also found something else that day, something that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. In the back of her closet, hidden inside an old shoebox, were dozens of handwritten notes filled with paranoid ramblings about me, about her co-workers, about neighbors she believed were spying on her. Some of them dated back over 6 months. Heather was diagnosed with a severe psychotic disorder that had apparently been developing for much longer than either of us realized. The doctors told me that her isolation, working alone from home day after day with minimal human contact, had likely accelerated whatever was already brewing in her brain chemistry. She had been hiding her symptoms, masking them behind that quiet intensity I once found so attractive, convincing herself that her paranoid thoughts were valid concerns rather than warning signs of something deeply wrong. I visited her once at the psychiatric facility, where they transferred her after the initial evaluation. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way I had never seen before, and she cried when she saw the healing scratches on my face. She told me she remembered everything but that it had felt like watching herself from outside her own body, powerless to stop what was happening. I believed her. I also knew that I could never sleep next to her again, never close my eyes in her presence without seeing that knife glinting in the moonlight. It has been almost 2 years since that night, and I still sleep with my bedroom door locked. I moved to a different city, started over at a new firm, and eventually began seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma from domestic violence. That label felt strange at first, domestic violence, because I had always pictured something different when I heard those words. But my therapist helped me understand that what happened to me counts, that the scars on my arms and the ones inside my head are real and valid regardless of the circumstances that caused them. Heather is still receiving treatment, and her mother sends me updates occasionally that I am never quite sure how to respond to. Sometimes I think about the version of our life that existed before that October night, the weekend brunches, and unfinished puzzles and lazy Sunday mornings. And it feels like remembering a movie I watched a long time ago, rather than something I actually lived. The hardest part is not the fear, though that still surfaces sometimes when I wake up in the dark and have to remind myself where I am. The hardest part is knowing that the danger was there all along, sleeping right beside me, and I never saw it until the blade was already swinging toward my throat. Still trying to put all of this into words because I spent so long convincing myself it was normal. I met Wesley at a coworker's birthday party in the spring of 2022, and he seemed like everything I had been looking for after years of terrible dates and even worse relationships. Charming, attentive, the kind of guy who remembered small details about conversations we had weeks before. My friends from nursing school kept saying I deserved someone like him. We moved in together after 8 months, and for a while, everything was perfect. He cooked dinner most nights, surprised me with flowers on random Tuesdays, called me during his lunch breaks just to hear my voice. I remember telling my mom on the phone that I finally understood what people meant when they said they found their person. She was so happy for me, and I was so certain I had figured out my life. My coworkers at the pediatric clinic where I worked used to tease me about how often I smiled at my phone when he texted. 26 years old, and convinced this was it, the real thing, the kind of love that actually lasts. The first time I saw Wesley drunk was at his company's holiday party that December. He had always been a social drinker around me, a beer or two with dinner, maybe a glass of wine on weekends, nothing that ever raised any concern. But that night he kept going back to the open bar, shot after shot, laughing too loud with his coworkers while I stood there not knowing anyone. By the time we left, he was someone I did not recognize. In the Uber home, he accused me of flirting with his boss, said I had embarrassed him in front of everyone by laughing at some joke the guy made. I tried to explain that I was just being polite, making small talk like anyone would at a work event, but he kept cutting me off, his voice getting louder each time. The driver kept glancing at us through the rearview mirror, and I wanted to disappear into the seat. When we got home, Wesley slammed the front door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall, then went straight to bed without another word. The next morning, he apologized with tears in his eyes, said the stress at work had been overwhelming, and he had drunk way more than he should have. He promised it would never happen again, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. For a few months after that, things went back to normal. Wesley cut back on drinking, at least around me, and I let myself forget how scared I had been in that Uber. We adopted a cat together, started talking about maybe getting engaged by the end of the year. I convinced myself that the holiday party was just a one-time thing, a bad night, the kind of story couples laugh about years later. But then his friend Todd had a bachelor party in March, and Wesley came home at 3 a.m. reeking of whiskey and stumbling into furniture. I was half asleep when I heard the front door open, and before I could even sit up, he was standing in the bedroom doorway asking why I had not answered his texts. I checked my phone, and there were 17 messages, each one angrier than the last, accusing me of ignoring him on purpose. I had been asleep. My phone was on silent because I had an early shift the next morning, but trying to explain that only made him angrier. He called me selfish, said I did not care about him, that any other girlfriend would have stayed up waiting. That became the pattern. Sober Wesley was sweet and considerate, the man I had fallen in love with. But when he drank, something shifted behind his eyes, and I never knew which version of him was coming home. Some nights he would just get quiet and pass out on the couch, and I would cover him with a blanket and feel relieved. Other nights he would pick fights over nothing, over dishes I had left in the sink, or a text from a male coworker he had seen on my phone. The accusations always came back to the same thing, that I was cheating, that I was looking at other men, that I did not love him enough. I started being careful about everything. I stopped mentioning male co-workers by name. I made sure the apartment was spotless before he got home on weekends when I knew he had been out with friends. I kept my phone face down on the table so he would not see notifications and get suspicious. I did not realize it then, but I was slowly shrinking my entire life to avoid setting him off. The isolation happened so gradually, I barely noticed it. First, it was my friend Kira, who Wesley said was a bad influence because she was single and liked going to bars. Then it was my co-worker June, who he claimed looked at him weird at a work event I had brought him to. One by one, he found reasons why the people in my life were problems. He never told me I could not see them, not directly. He just made it so exhausting that it was easier to stop trying. If I went out with friends, I would come home to hours of silent treatment or interrogation about where I had really been. If I talked on the phone with my mom for too long, he would sulk and say I cared more about her than about him. By the summer of 2023, my world had narrowed down to work and Wesley. I told myself it was just a phase, that once things calmed down at his job, he would go back to being the man I had fallen for. I kept waiting for that version of him to come back permanently. Then I lost my job. Budget cuts at the clinic meant they had to let go of 3 nurses, and I was one of them because I had the least seniority. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot after cleaning out my locker, crying and dreading having to tell Wesley. When I got home, he was surprisingly supportive at first. He said we would figure it out together, that I should take some time before jumping into another job, that he made enough to cover us both for a while. It felt like the old Wesley, the one who took care of me, and I let myself lean into that. But within a few weeks, the dynamic shifted in ways I had not expected. Suddenly every purchase I made was questioned. A coffee from the drive-thru, a new tube of mascara, groceries that he deemed too expensive. He started giving me a weekly allowance from our joint account, said it was just until I found something new, just to help us budget. I went from being an independent woman with my own income to asking permission to buy shampoo. And the worst part is that I felt guilty, like I owed him for supporting me, like I had no right to complain. The drinking got worse after that. Maybe it was the pressure of being the sole provider, or maybe he just stopped hiding it now that I was home all day with nowhere to go. He started keeping whiskey in the kitchen cabinet, bourbon on the nightstand. What used to be weekend drinking became every night drinking. I learned to gauge his mood by the sound of the bottle cap twisting open, by how many times I heard the clink of ice in his glass before dinner. 2 drinks meant he would be fine, maybe a little louder than usual, but manageable. 4 or more meant I needed to stay quiet, agree with everything, make myself small. I started cooking his favorite meals on nights when he seemed tense, thinking maybe if I just did everything right, he would not have a reason to get upset. I became an expert at reading the room, at noticing the slight tightening of his jaw, or the way he scrolled through his phone too aggressively. My whole existence revolved around preventing the next explosion. One night in October, he came home from a work happy hour already drunk. I could smell it on him the second he walked through the door, that sour mix of beer and something stronger. I was on the couch watching a cooking show, and he sat down next to me without saying anything. After a few minutes, he asked who I had been texting. I told him no one, because I had not touched my phone in hours. He grabbed it off the coffee table and started going through my messages, my photos, my email. I just sat there, too tired to argue, too scared to protest. When he did not find anything, he threw the phone back at me and said I must have deleted whatever I was hiding. Then he went to the kitchen and poured himself another drink. I stayed on that couch for 2 more hours, not moving, barely breathing, just waiting for him to pass out so I could finally exhale. That was my life. Not constant violence, not bruises I had to explain. Just this endless waiting, this permanent state of dread that never fully went away even on the good days. I thought about leaving all the time. I would lie awake at night running through the logistics in my head, trying to figure out how I could make it work. But the math never added up. I had no savings because Wesley controlled our finances. I had no job because I had been too anxious to interview properly. too exhausted from walking on eggshells to put together a decent resume. My name was not on the lease. My car was in his name because he had co-signed when my credit was not good enough. The few friends I had left lived in other states, and my mom was in a one-bedroom apartment with no space for me. Every path out led to a dead end, and Wesley knew it. He never said it out loud, but I could see it in the way he looked at me sometimes, this quiet confidence that I was not going anywhere. He would apologize after the bad nights, buy me flowers, promise to cut back on drinking, and I would stay because what else was I supposed to do? Sleep in my car, show up at my mother's door like a failure, start over with nothing at 27 years old. The night everything changed was a Saturday in November. Wesley had been drinking since noon because his college football team was playing some big rivalry game. By the time the game ended, he had finished most of a bottle of bourbon and was louder than I had ever seen him. I made the mistake of asking if he wanted me to order some food, thinking maybe getting something in his stomach would help. He snapped at me, said I was always nagging, always trying to control him. I apologized and went to the bedroom to get away from it, but he followed me. He stood in the doorway blocking my exit, going on about how I thought I was better than him, how I looked down on him for drinking, how I was probably planning to leave him the second I got a job. I kept saying I was not. I was not. I just wanted to order dinner, but he kept getting closer, backing me toward the wall, his voice getting louder until he was screaming inches from my face. I could feel the heat of his breath, could see the veins in his neck. He punched the wall right next to my head, and I felt the impact vibrate through my whole body. Something broke inside me in that moment. Not in a dramatic way, not like in the movies where the victim suddenly fights back. It was quieter than that. I just looked at the hole in the drywall, at the plastered dust on his knuckles, and I knew with absolute certainty that next time, it would be my face. Maybe not the next fight, maybe not even the one after that, but eventually. I could see the trajectory so clearly, like watching a car slide on ice toward a guardrail. He stormed out of the room after that, grabbed his keys, and left. I heard his truck peel out of the driveway, and I stood there staring at that hole in the wall for what felt like an hour. Then I called my mom. I had not really talked to her in months, had kept our conversation short and surface level because I did not want her to know how bad things had gotten. But that night I told her everything, and she listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she just said, "Come home." She would figure out the space. She would help me find a job. Just come home. I left the next morning while Wesley was still passed out. I took one suitcase, my cat, and my phone charger. I left behind 2 years of clothes, furniture we had picked out together, a life I had thought was going to be forever. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white, and I kept checking the rearview mirror expecting to see his truck behind me. The drive to my mom's place took 4 hours, and I cried for most of it, not because I was sad, but because I was terrified and relieved and angry at myself for staying so long. It has been almost a year now. I have a new job at a hospital 2 towns over from my mom. I am saving money, slowly rebuilding the friendships I let wither, learning how to exist without constantly scanning for danger. Wesley tried to contact me for a few months after I left. Texts that cycled between apologetic and threatening, voicemails where he sobbed and begged and then called me names in the same breath. I changed my number eventually, blocked him on everything. Some days I still flinch when I hear ice clinking in a glass, still tense up when someone raises their voice unexpectedly. I do not know if that ever fully goes away, but I got out. That is the part I need people to understand. It took me way too long, and I lost so much of myself in the process, but I got out. And if anyone reading this sees their own life in these words, please know that the logistics that seem impossible, the obstacles that feel insurmountable, they can be figured out. There are people who will help you. You just have to reach out, even when every part of you is convinced that you cannot. February in Minneapolis has a way of making everything feel frozen in place. Not just the ice on the sidewalks, but time itself. like the whole world is holding its breath waiting for spring. I remember that feeling perfectly the week my life started crumbling. Walking home from the clinic where I worked as a physical therapist, my boots crunching through gray slush while my phone buzzed with messages I was too exhausted to check. My graduating class from the University of Minnesota had their 10-year reunion coming up that May, which gives you an idea of where I was in life. Finally established in my career, proud of the small house I had scraped together enough savings to buy in a quiet neighborhood near Powderhorn Park, cautiously optimistic for the first time in years. I had been with Julian for almost 3 years by then. Met him at a friend's barbecue, fell hard and fast, moved in together after 8 months. He was charming in that effortless way that made everyone gravitate toward him at parties. He remembered birthdays, asked about your sick aunt, brought wine to dinner gatherings. My friends loved him. My mom called him the one. I believed it too, right up until the moment I found the messages on his phone from not one, not two, but 4 different women. When I confronted him, he cried. When I told him to leave, he begged. When I changed the locks, he went silent. That silence should have been a relief. Instead, it was the calm before something I never could have anticipated. The first sign came 3 days after I asked him to move out. My coworker Janine, someone I had known for 6 years and considered one of my closest friends, stopped responding to my texts. At first I figured she was busy. Her daughter had just started kindergarten. Her husband was traveling for work. But when I saw her in the break room that Friday, she looked at me with this expression I had never seen before. It was cold, almost pitying, like I was someone she had just heard terrible things about. She made small talk for maybe 30 seconds before excusing herself, and I stood there holding my coffee mug, completely confused. That weekend, my friend Troy from college texted me something strange. "Hey, Julian reached out. I didn't know things got that bad between you two. Hope you're getting the help you need." I read that message probably 15 times trying to decode it. What help? What had Julian told him? I called Troy immediately, but he let it go to voicemail. When he finally called back 2 days later, his voice had that careful, measured tone people use when they think they are talking to someone unstable. Troy told me that Julian had called him crying, saying he was worried about me, saying that I had been struggling with some issues, and that the breakup had pushed me over the edge. According to Julian, I had been having paranoid episodes, accusing him of things he never did, making up affairs that existed only in my imagination. He told Troy that he still loved me and wanted me to get better, that he was only reaching out because he cared about my well-being. Troy asked me gently, carefully, like he was talking to a child holding a knife, if I had considered seeing a therapist. I sat there on my couch with the phone pressed to my ear, my whole body going numb as I realized what was happening. Julian was not just moving on. He was rewriting our entire relationship, and he was using everyone I cared about to do it. I tried to explain the truth, the messages I found, the women, the lies, but I could hear the doubt in Troy's silence. Julian had gotten to him first, and now everything I said just sounded like the ravings of a woman who could not accept reality. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself with sickening precision. My cousin Elise, who I had been close with since childhood, called to say she was there for me, in a way that made it clear she thought I was falling apart. My neighbor Wanda, an older woman who had always waved at me from her garden, started avoiding eye contact when I walked past. My supervisor at the clinic, a no-nonsense woman named Francine who I had always respected, pulled me into her office to ask if everything was okay at home, because someone had reached out with concerns. I asked who. She said she was not at liberty to say, but her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Julian was methodical. He was patient. He picked the people who mattered most to me, the ones whose opinions I valued, whose support I relied on, and he poisoned each of them one by one. And the worst part was that he did it while wearing the mask of a concerned ex-boyfriend who just wanted me to be okay. He made himself look like the victim by pretending to be worried about the real victim. He was so good at it that sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe I was the crazy one. Maybe I had imagined everything. I started keeping a folder on my phone with screenshots of everything. The original messages I found on his phone before he could delete them, the texts from friends asking if I was okay, timestamps and dates for every strange interaction. I needed proof, not just for other people but for myself, because the constant gaslighting was starting to make me question my own memories. That folder became my lifeline, a reminder that I was not losing my mind, that the things I remembered had actually happened. But Julian was escalating. 3 weeks after the breakup, I came home from work to find a bouquet of white lilies on my doorstep. My favorite flowers, the ones he used to buy me on our anniversary. There was no card, no note, nothing to indicate who had left them. When I texted him asking if they were from him, he replied with a single question mark, like he had no idea what I was talking about. The next morning, I found another bouquet in the exact same spot. This time I checked my doorbell camera, but the footage showed nothing. Just an empty porch one frame and flowers the next, as if they had materialized out of thin air. I went through the settings and realized someone had deleted the footage remotely. Julian still had the password from when we set up the system together, and I had never thought to change it. That realization sent me spiraling into a kind of fear I had never experienced before. If he could access my doorbell camera, what else could he see? I spent that entire Saturday changing every password I could think of: email, bank accounts, streaming services, the smart thermostat, even the Wi-Fi router. My fingers were trembling so badly that I kept making typos and having to start over. I called my phone provider and asked them to check if there were any unknown devices linked to my account. There were 2. One was an old tablet I'd forgotten about. The other was a phone I had never seen before, added to my account 3 months ago while Julian and I were still together. The representative's voice was calm and professional as she helped me remove it, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. He had been tracking me. For months, maybe longer, he had been watching where I went, reading my messages, listening to my calls. Every private conversation I thought I was having in confidence, with my mom, with my friends, with my therapist. He had access to all of it. That was how he knew exactly who to contact, exactly what to say, exactly which buttons to push to make people doubt me. I had been living inside his surveillance the whole time, like an insect trapped under glass, thinking I was free while he watched my every move. I went to the police the next morning, a Sunday, sitting in that fluorescent-lit waiting room for almost 2 hours before an officer finally called my name. His name tag said Officer Hendricks, a heavyset man with tired eyes who looked like he had heard 1,000 stories just like mine. I showed him everything: the screenshots, the deleted camera footage, the unauthorized device on my phone account, the messages from friends proving Julian was contacting them behind my back. He listened, nodded, took notes in a little spiral pad, and then told me there was not much they could do. Julian had not made any direct threats. The flowers could have been from anyone. Accessing a shared account was not technically illegal if he had been given the password at some point. Hendricks suggested I get a restraining order if I felt unsafe, but warned me that without evidence of physical threat or harassment, it probably would not be granted. I walked out of that station feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. The system was not designed to protect people like me from people like Julian. It was designed to wait until something terrible happened, and then maybe, if I was lucky, do something about it afterward. The confrontation happened 4 days later, on a Wednesday evening that started out almost peaceful. I had just gotten home from work and was heating up leftover soup when my doorbell rang. I checked the camera. I had changed all the passwords, installed new software, done everything I could to lock Julian out, and saw him standing on my porch. He was wearing the blue sweater I had bought him for his birthday, the one he knew I loved, and he was holding a single white lily in his hand. My whole body went rigid. I did not answer the door. I watched him through the camera as he stood there for 1 minute, then 2, then 5, his expression shifting from patient to annoyed to something darker, something I had only glimpsed a few times during our relationship. He leaned close to the camera, close enough that I could see the pores on his nose, and said in a voice so calm it made my skin prickle, "I know you're watching, sweetheart. I know you're always watching. But you should know that I'm watching too. And I'm much better at this game than you are." Then he smiled, placed the lily gently on the doormat, and walked away into the darkness. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the house turned on, a kitchen knife on the cushion beside me, watching the doorbell camera feed on my phone until my eyes burned. The next few days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I started taking different routes to work, leaving at odd hours, parking in different spots every day. I told Francine I was dealing with a personal situation and asked to adjust my schedule so I would never be alone at the clinic during opening or closing. She agreed, but I could see the concern in her eyes. Not concern for my safety, but concern about my mental state, which meant Julian's story had already taken root. I stopped answering calls from numbers I did not recognize. I stopped checking my mailbox for days at a time because I was afraid of what I might find there. My mother called me one evening, and the first thing she said was, "Honey, Julian came by the house today. He's really worried about you." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. He had driven 3 hours to my mother's house in St. Cloud, sat in her living room, drank her coffee, and told her God knows what about me. When I tried to explain the truth, my own mother, the woman who raised me, who knew me better than anyone, hesitated before saying, "Sweetheart, maybe you should talk to someone, a professional. Julian said you've been having episodes, and I just want to make sure you're okay." I hung up on her. It was the first time in my life I had ever done that, and I immediately felt sick with guilt, but I could not listen to another word. That Friday, I came home to find my back door unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I had started checking every lock 3 times before leaving, a new ritual born from fear. But when I turned the handle, it swung open without resistance. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. My laptop was still on the kitchen table where I had left it. My jewelry box was untouched. But something was different, something I could not identify at first. A wrongness in the air that made my lungs feel tight. Then I saw it. On my bedroom pillow, placed exactly in the center like a mint at a hotel, was a photograph. It was a picture of me sleeping, taken from inside my own bedroom, the angle suggesting the photographer had been standing right next to my bed. I was wearing the old college t-shirt I had slept in 2 nights ago. My mouth was slightly open. I looked peaceful, completely unaware that someone was standing over me in the dark, watching me close enough to touch me. On the back of the photo, written in Julian's handwriting, were 4 words. "You look so peaceful." I do not remember calling the police. I do not remember what I said to them. I only remember sitting on my front steps in the cold, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, waiting for the sirens while the photograph sat on the ground beside me like a dead thing I could not bear to touch again. This time, they had to take me seriously. The officers who responded that night were different from Officer Hendricks. A woman named Sergeant Adler took one look at the photograph, the handwriting on the back, and the doorbell footage from the week before, and her jaw tightened in a way that told me she understood exactly what she was looking at. She asked me detailed questions about Julian, his full name, his address, his workplace, his vehicle, his habits. She took the photograph as evidence, dusted my back door for fingerprints, and had a locksmith come out that same night to change every lock in my house and install a deadbolt on my bedroom door. Before she left, she gave me her card and told me to call her directly if anything else happened, day or night. "Men like this," she said, standing on my porch with her hand resting on her belt, "they don't stop on their own. They stop when the consequences become real for them, or they don't stop at all. We're going to make sure the consequences become very real." The restraining order was filed the next morning, and this time it was granted. Julian was served at his workplace, in front of his colleagues, which I later learned was intentional on Sergeant Adler's part. She wanted to crack his perfect image, to let people see that the charming, concerned ex-boyfriend was actually under a court order to stay away from the woman he claimed to be worried about. For a while it worked. Julian kept his distance, at least physically. The flowers stopped appearing. My back door stayed locked. But the damage to my reputation had already been done, and I spent the following months trying to rebuild relationships that had been poisoned by his lies. Some people came around once they heard about the restraining order, once they realized that the situation was serious enough for the courts to get involved. Troy called to apologize, sounding genuinely shaken. My mother drove down from St. Cloud and sat with me for 3 days, crying and holding my hand and saying she was sorry she had not believed me. But others never came back. Janine transferred to a different clinic without ever speaking to me again. My cousin Elise sent me a long message saying she did not want to take sides and thought it was best if we took a break from our friendship. I learned something important during that time. You can tell people the truth, you can show them evidence, you can have the law on your side, and some of them will still choose to believe the version of reality that is easier for them to accept. Julian had planted seeds of doubt so deep that even proof could not dig them out. I still live in Minneapolis, still work at the same clinic, still walk the same streets I walked when I was with him. But I'm not the same person I was before. I check my locks obsessively. I keep pepper spray in my purse and a bat beside my bed. I look over my shoulder when I walk to my car at night. And sometimes when the light hits a stranger's face a certain way, my heart still pounds like it is trying to escape my chest. Julian moved out of state 8 months after the restraining order was filed. I know because Sergeant Adler calls me every few months to give me updates, a kindness I never expected from the system that had initially failed me. But even with him gone, even with an entire state between us, I cannot shake the feeling that he is still watching. That somewhere out there, he is waiting for the restraining order to expire, waiting for me to let my guard down, waiting for his next opportunity to remind me that he is much better at this game than I am. I hope I never find out if that feeling is right. Sometimes I still catch myself checking the locks twice before bed, even though Wes moved out over a year ago. Old habits, I guess. We were together for almost 2 years, living in a small apartment in Louisville, Kentucky, the kind of place with thin walls where you could hear your neighbors arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash. I met him through mutual friends at a barbecue. Nothing special, just burgers and cheap beer in someone's backyard. He was funny, charming, had this way of listening to you like every word mattered. By the time my class of 2012 reunion rolled around, we were already sharing a lease and talking about getting a dog. My old classmates kept telling me how happy I looked, how lucky I was to find someone like him, and for a while I believed them. I work as a nurse at a local hospital, long shifts that leave you exhausted, and coming home to Wes felt like a relief back then. He would have dinner ready, ask about my day, make me laugh after 12 hours of dealing with difficult patients. That version of him feels like a stranger now. The first time he scared me was over something stupid. Dishes in the sink. He had left them piling up for 3 days, and I made a comment about it when I got home from work. Nothing mean, just tired, like, hey, can you take care of that tomorrow? He turned around so fast I stepped back without thinking. His whole face changed, jaw tight, eyes hard, and he slammed his fist into the kitchen counter. The laminate cracked right down the middle. That sound, that sharp crack, I can still hear it if I think about it too long. We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Then he apologized, said work had been stressful, said it would never happen again. I wanted to believe him, so I did. That is what you do when you love someone. You tell yourself it was a one-time thing. You file it away in the back of your mind, and you move forward. But things like that, they do not stay filed away. They sit there, waiting. After that night, things were good for a few months. Wes started seeing a therapist, said he wanted to work on his anger issues, and I thought we had turned a corner. He bought me flowers, planned weekend trips, did all the things that made me fall for him in the first place. I convinced myself that the counter incident was an isolated event, a glitch in an otherwise healthy relationship. But then, there was the time he punched a hole in the bedroom wall because I forgot to text him when I got to work. And the time he threw his phone across the room so hard it shattered against the refrigerator because his boss criticized him during a meeting. Each time he apologized. Each time he promised to do better. And each time, I noticed that the explosions were getting closer together, the triggers smaller. I started monitoring my own behavior, choosing my words carefully, tiptoeing around certain topics. I did not realize it then, but I was slowly shrinking myself to fit into the spaces his anger left behind. The day everything changed started like any other Saturday. We slept in, made breakfast together, watched some documentary about deep-sea creatures that Wes had been wanting to see. Around noon, he said he wanted to talk about something important. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and he asked me to sit down on the couch. I remember thinking he was going to propose, that all the therapy had worked and he was ready for the next step. Instead, he told me that his therapist had helped him identify something about himself. He said he had been having violent thoughts, intrusive ones, that came to him during moments when he felt overwhelmed or upset. He described them as flashes, images that appeared in his mind without warning. He said sometimes, when we argued, he would picture himself hurting me, choking me, hitting me. He said the images were so vivid that he could almost feel his hands doing it. I sat there on that couch, our breakfast dishes still in the sink. The TV paused on a shot of some bioluminescent fish, and I had no idea what to say. He kept talking, filling the silence I could not fill. He said his therapist told him these were intrusive thoughts, that lots of people have them, that they do not mean he would ever act on them. He said the fact that he was disturbed by these images was actually a good sign, proof that he was not a violent person at his core. He reached for my hand while he spoke and I let him take it, but my fingers felt numb, disconnected from the rest of my body. He said he wanted to be honest with me because he loved me, because he trusted me, because hiding this felt like a betrayal. I remember nodding, saying something like, "I appreciate you telling me," but my voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. The whole time he was talking, I kept thinking about all those moments when his face would change during arguments, when his eyes would go dark and empty for just a second before he caught himself. I always thought he was just angry. Now I knew what he was seeing in those moments. He was seeing his hands around my throat. That night I could not sleep. Wes fell asleep easily, the way he always did, like confessing something that heavy had lifted a weight off his shoulders. I lay there next to him in the dark, listening to him breathe, and I could not stop my mind from racing. Every time he shifted in his sleep, I flinched. Every time his arm brushed against mine, I tensed up. I kept replaying his words, trying to convince myself that he was right, that intrusive thoughts were normal, that having them did not make him dangerous. But then I thought about the cracked counter, the hole in the wall, the shattered phone. Those were not thoughts, those were actions. And the line between thinking about violence and committing violence suddenly seemed very thin, almost invisible. I got up around 4 in the morning, went to the kitchen, and just stood there in the dark looking at the crack in the laminate that we never got fixed. I traced it with my finger, feeling the rough edge where his fist had landed, and I wondered how many times he had pictured doing that to my face instead. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. I tried to act normal, to pretend that his confession had not changed everything between us, but it had. I started noticing things I had ignored before. The way he would clench his jaw when I said something he did not like. The way his hands would ball into fists during small disagreements, even when his voice stayed calm. The way he would stare at me sometimes, just stare, with this blank expression that I used to think meant he was lost in thought. Now I wondered what thoughts he was lost in. I called my sister one afternoon while Wes was at work, and I tried to explain what he had told me without making it sound too alarming. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she asked me a question that I could not answer. She asked if I felt safe. I told her yes because that was what I was supposed to say. but the word tasted like a lie in my mouth. The truth was, I did not know anymore. The truth was, I had started hiding the kitchen knives in a different drawer, one he would not think to check. A month after his confession, we had an argument about money. Something small, a credit card bill that was higher than expected. Wes was already in a bad mood because of something that happened at his job, and my comment about the bill set him off. He did not hit me. He did not even raise his voice at first. But he backed me into a corner of the living room, literally, physically backed me into a corner with his body, and he stood there breathing hard, his face inches from mine. I could smell the coffee on his breath, see the vein pulsing in his neck. He did not say anything for what felt like a full minute. He just stood there, blocking my path, his fists clenched at his sides. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that he was seeing one of those images. He was seeing himself hurting me. I could tell by the way his eyes flickered, the way his whole body seemed to vibrate with something he was trying to hold back. Then he stepped away, walked to the bedroom, and closed the door. I stayed in that corner for 10 minutes, my back pressed against the wall, too scared to move. I started making a plan after that night. Nothing dramatic, just small things. I opened a separate bank account and started putting a little money in it every week. I made copies of my important documents and left them at my sister's place. I started keeping my car keys in my pocket instead of on the hook by the door. Wes noticed something was different, I could tell, but he did not say anything directly. Instead, he became sweeter, more attentive, like he was trying to make up for something he had not technically done. He brought me flowers, cooked my favorite meals, told me he loved me more often than usual. Part of me wanted to believe that he was trying, that the therapy was working, that we could still make this work. But another part of me, the part that had stood in that corner watching his fists clench and unclench, knew better. I read articles online about intrusive thoughts, trying to understand what he was going through. The articles said these thoughts were common, that most people who have them never act on them, that they were more distressing to the person having them than to anyone else. But those articles were not written about people who had already punched holes in walls. They were not written about people who backed their partners into corners and stood there vibrating with barely contained rage. The day I finally left started like any other morning. We had coffee together, talked about nothing important, and he kissed me goodbye before heading to work. I waited until his car turned the corner at the end of our street. Then I moved faster than I had ever moved in my life. I had already packed a bag and hidden it in the trunk of my car 2 days earlier. I grabbed my laptop, the folder with my documents, and the small box where I kept jewelry my grandmother had left me. I took one last look at the apartment, at the cracked counter and the patched hole in the bedroom wall and the couch where he had told me about the images in his head. Then I walked out, and I did not look back. I drove to my sister's house 3 hours away, checking my rearview mirror the whole time, half expecting to see his car following me. He called me 17 times that afternoon. I did not answer. I sent him one text message that evening, telling him it was over, telling him not to contact me again. He responded with a wall of text, apologies and promises and accusations all mixed together, ending with a sentence that still keeps me up at night. He wrote that he had never been closer to acting on those thoughts than he was at that moment. I blocked his number after that message, blocked him on every social media platform I could think of, and told my sister not to tell anyone where I was staying. For weeks I jumped every time my phone buzzed, every time a car drove slowly past the house, every time someone knocked on the door. My sister installed extra locks and bought a security camera for the front porch. I filed for a restraining order, which was granted after I showed the judge the text message he had sent me. The judge read it twice, looked at me over her glasses, and asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I told her I did. What I did not tell her was that I still woke up in the middle of the night sometimes, heart pounding, certain that I had heard his footsteps in the hallway. I did not tell her that I had started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, or that I flinched whenever a man raised his voice in public. Some things you do not say out loud because saying them makes them too real. You just carry them with you. like stones in your pockets, and you hope that someday they will feel lighter. It has been 14 months since I left. Wes tried to contact me a few times through mutual friends, but they all told him to leave me alone. Last I heard, he moved to another state, somewhere out west, and started dating someone new. I think about her sometimes, this woman I have never met, and I wonder if he told her what he told me. I wonder if she notices the way his eyes go empty during arguments, if she has started hiding things without knowing why, if she lies awake at night wondering about the line between a thought and an action. I hope she is safe. I hope he really is just someone with intrusive thoughts who would never act on them. But I also know what I felt in that corner, pressed against the wall, watching him fight against something inside himself. I know what I read in that final text message, and I know that I got out just in time. Some people might say I overreacted, that I should have given him more of a chance, that leaving someone over thoughts they cannot control is cruel. But those people have never felt what I felt. They have never had to choose between empathy and survival. I chose survival, and I would make the same choice again. My graduating class from nursing school had their 10-year reunion last spring, which puts into perspective how long I spent believing I had found the perfect relationship. I had been working as a dental hygienist at a family practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico, for about 2 years when I matched with Vincent on a dating app. He had this disarming smile in his photos and a bio that mentioned loving rescue dogs and hiking in the Sandias. Our first date lasted 5 hours. Dinner turned into drinks, turned into walking around Old Town until the shops closed. He listened like nobody had ever listened to me before, asking follow-up questions, remembering every detail. When he texted me the next morning with a reference to an obscure movie I had mentioned loving as a kid, I thought I had hit the jackpot. I told my sister Noelle that this one felt different. She warned me that charm could be a mask, but I laughed her off. 6 months into the relationship, Vincent had basically moved into my apartment. It happened gradually, a toothbrush here, a drawer there, until one day I realized most of his clothes were in my closet. I did not mind at first because everything still felt like a dream. He would have coffee ready when I woke up, knew my work schedule better than I did, and always seemed to anticipate what I needed before I asked. But then the small things started piling up in ways I could not ignore. He mentioned a conversation I had with my best friend Wendy over the phone, a private call I took in my car during lunch break. When I asked how he knew about it, he shrugged and said I must have told him. I knew I had not. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above our bed, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. The incidents kept accumulating like drops of water filling a bucket. One Wednesday, I decided on a whim to stop by a bookstore after work, a place I had never been to, chosen completely at random because I passed it on my way home, and the window display caught my eye. I spent maybe 40 minutes browsing, bought a paperback novel, and drove home. When I walked through the door, Vincent looked up from his laptop and asked if I found anything good at the bookstore. I had not told him I was going. I had not texted anyone about it. The decision had been entirely spontaneous, made in the span of 3 seconds while sitting at a red light. I asked him how he knew, and he gave me this look, patient, almost amused, and said my car had been parked there for a while, so he assumed. I did not ask how he knew where my car was parked. Some part of me was already too afraid of the answer. A week later, I tested him without meaning to. My coworker Jill invited me to her daughter's birthday party on Saturday afternoon, and I mentioned it to Vincent over dinner, telling him it started at 3. The party actually started at 2. I wanted to see if he would slip up, if he somehow knew the real time from somewhere other than me. Saturday came, and around 1:30, Vincent casually mentioned that I should probably start getting ready since the party started in half an hour. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I had told him 3 o'clock. I specifically remembered saying 3. He saw my face and quickly added that he must have misheard, that he thought I said 2. but the way his eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, told me he knew exactly what he had done. That night, after he fell asleep, I went through my phone with trembling fingers, checking every app, every setting, looking for something I could not name but knew had to be there. I found it buried 3 screens deep in my location settings, an app I did not recognize, disguised with a generic icon that looked like a system utility. When I searched the name online, my chest tightened so hard I thought I might pass out. It was tracking software, the kind marketed to parents who want to monitor their teenagers, but used by people like Vincent for something far more sinister. It logged my GPS location every 30 seconds. It recorded my text messages, my calls, my browsing history. It could even activate my microphone remotely. The app had been installed 8 months ago, which meant it had been on my phone since our 2nd month of dating, back when he would borrow my phone to look something up or take a photo of us together. I sat on the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, reading article after article about stalkerware, about intimate partner surveillance, about women whose lives had been dismantled by someone who claimed to love them. I deleted the app immediately, then realized that might have been a mistake. Vincent acted completely normal the next morning. He made breakfast, kissed my forehead, asked about my plans for the day. I watched his face for any sign that he knew I had found the app, any flicker of awareness that his window into my life had been closed. Nothing. His calm terrified me more than anger would have. I called my sister during my lunch break, whispering in the supply closet at work, telling her everything I had discovered. Noelle did not hesitate. She told me I needed to leave, that this was not love but control, that men like Vincent did not stop at digital surveillance. She offered me her guest room in Denver, said I could stay as long as I needed. I told her I would think about it, but the truth was, I had already made up my mind. That evening, I waited until Vincent left for his weekly poker game with friends. Then I packed 2 suitcases with everything essential and loaded them into my car. I left my keys on the kitchen counter and drove west on I-40 without looking back. The first 2 weeks at Noelle's place felt like emerging from underwater. I got a new phone with a new number, created fresh email accounts, and changed every password I could think of. I blocked Vincent on everything, though I knew he probably had backup ways to find me. My sister lived in a quiet neighborhood with a security system and a German shepherd named Bowie, who barked at every shadow. I started sleeping through the night again. I applied for dental hygienist positions in the Denver area, and even went on 2 interviews that seemed promising. For a brief window, I let myself believe that leaving had been enough, that Vincent would move on to someone else, that my nightmare was over. Then, the flowers arrived. A bouquet of white lilies, my favorite, a detail I had mentioned once during our first month together, delivered to my sister's front door with a card that said only, "I understand you needed space. I can wait." There was no sender name, no return address, but the message was clear. He knew exactly where I was. I called the police that same afternoon, shaking as I explained the situation to an officer who looked barely old enough to drink. He took notes, nodded sympathetically, and told me there was not much they could do about flowers. No direct threat had been made, no law had been broken. He suggested I document everything and consider a restraining order, though he warned me those were difficult to obtain without evidence of physical danger. I wanted to scream at him that the danger was real, that Vincent had been inside my phone for months, that he had driven 6 hours to find my sister's address without me telling a single person where I was going. But I kept my voice steady and thanked him for his time. That night, Noelle and I went through her house inch by inch, checking for anything unusual. We found it in her living room, a small device the size of a button battery, stuck to the underside of the coffee table. Vincent had been inside the house. He had been close enough to plant a listening device while we slept, or while we were at work. Noelle called a locksmith at 11 at night, and neither of us closed our eyes until every lock in the house had been replaced. The next few days blurred into a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. I started noticing things I had overlooked before. A car that seemed to idle too long at the end of the block, A man in a baseball cap walking past the house twice in 1 hour. The sensation of being watched even when I was alone in a room with the blinds drawn tight. Noelle took time off work to stay with me, and we developed a routine of checking every window latch, every door lock, every corner of every room before settling in for the night. I filed for a restraining order, gathering every piece of evidence I had. Screenshots of the Stalkerware app, photos of the listening device, the card that came with the flowers. The judge granted a temporary order, which meant Vincent was legally required to stay 500 feet away from me and have no contact whatsoever. When he was served with the papers, he did not contest them. He did not show up to the hearing. His silence felt like a predator waiting in tall grass, patient and certain that his moment would come. 3 weeks after the restraining order was issued, I received an email to my new address, the one I had created specifically to escape him, the one I had only used for job applications and communication with my sister. The subject line was empty. The body of the message contained a single photograph. Me, sitting in Noelle's kitchen that same morning, drinking coffee in my pajamas. The photo was taken through the window above the sink, shot from the backyard at an angle that suggested he had been crouched behind the fence. I could see the timestamp embedded in the image file, 7:42 in the morning, exactly when I remembered standing at that counter. I showed the photo to the police, to the detective now assigned to my case, to anyone who would listen. They increased patrols in the neighborhood. They took the restraining order violation seriously. But Vincent was a ghost. His apartment in Albuquerque had been vacated. His car was registered to an address that turned out to be an empty lot. His phone number was disconnected. On paper, he had ceased to exist, but I knew he was out there, circling closer, waiting for the moment my guard slipped. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Noelle's neighbor, a retired electrician named Howard, mentioned that he had seen a cable company van parked on the street several times over the past month, always in the early morning, always gone by the time anyone was fully awake. He thought it was strange because nobody on the block had scheduled any service calls. I passed the information to the detective, a woman named Arlene Kendall, who had started treating my case like a personal mission. She pulled traffic camera footage from the area and traced the van to a rental company in Colorado Springs. The credit card used for the rental belonged to a man named David Merritt, a name I had never heard. But when Detective Kendall showed me his driver's license photo, the air left my lungs in a single painful rush. It was Vincent. Different hair, glasses I had never seen him wear, but unmistakably him. He had created an entirely new identity to continue watching me. The police issued a warrant that same day, and within 48 hours they found him in a motel room 12 miles from my sister's house, surrounded by printed photographs of me, detailed logs of my daily movements, and equipment I could not even identify. Vincent was arrested and charged with stalking, violation of a protective order, identity fraud, and illegal surveillance. The trial took place 8 months later, and I sat in that courtroom for 3 days, listening to prosecutors describe the scope of what he had done. The stalkerware on my phone had captured over 4,000 hours of audio. He had cloned my email accounts, my cloud storage, my social media. Everything I thought was private had been an open window for him to climb through. His defense attorney argued that he was mentally ill, that his obsession stemmed from a genuine belief that we were meant to be together. The jury did not buy it. They convicted him on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 7 years in state prison. I moved to a different city after the trial, somewhere I will not name, somewhere I have tried to build a life that does not revolve around looking over my shoulder every second of every day. Some nights I still wake up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, certain that I heard a noise outside my window. I check my phone for unfamiliar apps more often than I care to admit. The locks on my doors are the best money can buy, and I never park in the same spot twice. Vincent taught me that love can be a disguise, that attention can be a cage, and that some people will dismantle your entire sense of safety just to keep you close. I survived him, but I am not sure I will ever stop running. The year everything shifted. Life looked ordinary from the outside. Work had settled into a predictable rhythm. Evenings were quiet, and the relationship I was in had already lasted long enough to feel permanent. Friends knew us as the steady couple, the ones who didn't fight in public and showed up together to birthdays and holidays. I shared an apartment with someone I trusted deeply, someone who had once felt like a safe place after long days. Back then, my biggest worries were money and the feeling that my career had stalled. Nothing about my routine suggested danger, and that's probably why it took me so long to notice how much was changing inside our walls. The setback came quietly, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow unraveling. A professional disappointment hit harder than I expected, and it bruised my confidence in ways I didn't know how to explain. The person I lived with reacted differently than I imagined, becoming unusually attentive at first, then oddly controlling in subtle ways. Questions started sounding less like concern and more like monitoring. Comments about my schedule, my phone, even the way I dressed began slipping into conversations disguised as jokes. None of it was loud or explosive, just a steady pressure that made home feel smaller each day. Friends were the first to notice something I couldn't fully articulate yet. I stopped answering messages quickly and started canceling plans without clear reasons. When I did show up, I was quieter, distracted, always checking the time. A close friend, Noah, asked once if everything was okay, and I remember brushing it off with a tired laugh. It was easier to downplay than to explain the constant tension that followed me around. I didn't have a single incident to point to, just a growing sense that I needed to be careful all the time. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere kept tightening. Doors were closed more often, conversations happened in lowered voices, and silence became a kind of warning. Small disagreements lingered far longer than they should have, stretched into hours of cold distance. I began memorizing routines, learning which topics to avoid and when to stay quiet. The relationship hadn't turned violent in any obvious way, which made it harder to name what was happening. Still, every day ended with the same thought. Whatever this had become, it wasn't what it used to be. What changed next didn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It showed up in rules that were never spoken out loud. Certain friends suddenly became bad influences, according to casual comments dropped during dinner. If I stayed out later than expected, the mood at home shifted into something sharp and punishingly quiet. Personal things moved slightly from where I remembered leaving them, just enough to make me doubt myself. I began keeping track of tiny details without realizing why, like the position of keys or whether a light had been left on. Sleep came in fragments, and mornings felt heavier than they should have. Home no longer reset me. It drained me. The sense of being watched grew, even during moments that used to feel private. The fear didn't arrive all at once, which is what made it so confusing. It accumulated in my chest during ordinary moments like standing at the sink or scrolling through my phone. Certain questions started carrying consequences, and wrong answers led to long, suffocating evenings. I learned how to speak carefully, choosing words the way someone picks their steps on ice. Apologies became frequent, even when I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. I stopped trusting my own reactions and relied instead on predicting theirs. The relationship had become a maze, and I was constantly trying not to hit the walls. Nothing dramatic happened, yet every day ended with relief that it was finally over. Friends kept checking in, and I kept deflecting. One of them, Marlon, noticed bruises under my eyes from lack of sleep, and asked again if I felt safe. The word safe stuck with me longer than the conversation itself. I laughed it off, saying things were just stressful at home, that everyone goes through rough patches. What I didn't say was how my body reacted to the sound of the front door opening. I didn't mention how my phone battery dying made my pulse spike. Admitting fear felt like betrayal, not just of my partner, but of the version of my life I'd presented to everyone else. So I stayed quiet and hoped it would pass. The day authorities became involved didn't start any differently than the others. Routine carried me through the morning, right up until a moment where the tension finally spilled beyond the apartment walls. A neighbor had heard raised voices and called for help, something I'd never done myself. When officers asked questions, my first instinct was still to minimize, to protect, to smooth things over. Then one of them asked how long I'd felt afraid. The answer surprised me as it left my mouth. Months, not days, not weeks, but months of slow, silent erosion. Saying it out loud made the truth impossible to ignore. Once the truth surfaced, everything moved faster than I was prepared for. Statements were taken, questions repeated in different ways, and suddenly my private life felt exposed under fluorescent lights. I remember sitting on a stiff chair, hands clasped together trying to explain something that had never had a single starting point. There was no dramatic incident to describe, just a pattern that had slowly reshaped my days. The officers listened carefully, and one of them said something that stayed with me. Harm doesn't always leave visible marks. Hearing that felt validating and devastating at the same time. It meant what I'd lived through was real, but it also meant I'd been living in danger longer than I wanted to admit. Leaving the apartment didn't happen in a dramatic rush. It was methodical, almost clinical. I packed essentials while someone else stood nearby, making sure nothing escalated. Familiar objects looked different when I knew I wouldn't be coming back to them. The couch where I'd spent countless evenings felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else's life. My partner barely spoke, and that silence felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Walking out with a bag over my shoulder felt unreal, like stepping off a stage after a performance that had gone on far too long. Relief came in waves, mixed with guilt I couldn't fully explain. In the weeks that followed, friends filled in the quiet spaces I hadn't realized were empty. Conversations happened slowly, carefully, as if everyone was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I started noticing how tense my body had been, how simple things like sleeping through the night now felt like small victories. Therapy helped me understand how control can disguise itself as concern, how fear can become normalized when it grows gradually. I replayed moments from the past months and saw them differently, clearer, sharper. The danger hadn't appeared overnight. It had been assembling itself piece by piece while I adjusted instead of resisted. Today, I share this because I know how easy it is to miss the signs when nothing looks violent on the surface. What happened to me wasn't sudden, and that's what made it so dangerous. If someone had asked me earlier whether I was in trouble, I would have said no without hesitation. Now I know better. Safety isn't just the absence of bruises or shouting. It's the presence of peace. I'm still rebuilding, still learning to trust my instincts again. But I'm out. And even though I don't understand exactly when the line was crossed, I'm grateful I didn't wait any longer to leave. Living in a mid-sized apartment complex meant learning the rhythms of other people's lives whether you wanted to or not. At the time this happened, I was working irregular hours and sleeping lightly, always half aware of doors slamming or voices echoing through the courtyard. That night had the heavy quiet that usually settles after midnight, the kind where even small noises travel too far. I was scrolling on my phone on the couch, lights off, when raised voices cut straight through the walls. It wasn't playful arguing or drunk laughter, but sharp, brittle shouting that sounded rehearsed from long practice. I recognized the voices from the unit across the hall, a couple named Mason and Lily who had moved in months earlier. They were polite in passing, but the tension between them always lingered like a smell you couldn't place. Hearing them fight wasn't new, but the intensity that night felt different, more focused, like something had finally snapped. The argument spilled into the hallway, their door thrown open so hard it bounced against the frame. Mason's voice was loud enough that I could make out full sentences, accusations piling up without pause. Lily replied in shorter bursts, her tone clipped and controlled, which somehow made it worse. A few other doors cracked open an inch or two, just enough for eyes to peek through the dark. I stayed still, listening, telling myself not to get involved, the way everyone does in shared buildings. At one point, something heavy hit the wall inside their apartment, followed by a sharp thud on the floor. Then came a sudden stop, as if someone had flipped a switch. The door closed slowly this time, clicking into place with an oddly careful sound. After that, nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the hum of the building settling back into itself. Sleep never really came after that. My mind kept replaying the last few seconds, especially how deliberate that door sounded when it shut. Morning light crept in through the blinds, and by then the whole thing already felt unreal, like a bad dream fading at the edges. When I stepped into the hallway to take out trash, Mason was there, leaning against the wall and staring at his phone. He looked exhausted but strangely calm, too calm for someone who'd been screaming hours earlier. He nodded at me and mentioned, casually, that Lily had taken off during the night after their fight. According to him, she grabbed a bag and left to cool down, something she'd done before. The way he said it felt practiced, like a line repeated until it sounded true. I remember thinking how odd it was that I hadn't heard the door open again. Later that day, the mood in the building shifted as quiet questions started circulating. One neighbor mentioned checking the security feed after realizing their car had been scratched overnight. The cameras covered the hallway and main exit, and curiosity turned into unease when people noticed gaps in the timeline. Lily never appeared leaving the building, not on foot, not through the garage, not anywhere the cameras could see. Someone else pointed out that her phone hadn't pinged outside the complex after the argument, based on a shared family plan notification. By evening, police were walking the halls, asking measured questions and taking notes. Standing in my doorway, watching them disappear into Mason's apartment, I felt a creeping certainty that the silence after that door closed wasn't empty at all. The next day blurred into a strange waiting period, like everyone in the building was holding their breath without admitting it. Officers returned with more questions, this time slower and more precise, asking about sounds, timing, even the way the argument ended. I told them about the hallway, the object hitting the wall, and how the door closed softly instead of slamming. One of them wrote that down and paused longer than the others, his pen hovering as if he didn't want to commit it to paper yet. Mason stayed inside his unit most of the day, curtains drawn, refusing to open the door unless prompted by police. When he did step out briefly to smoke, his movements were controlled, almost careful, as if every gesture was being rehearsed in his head. The story about Lily leaving stayed the same, word for word, no matter who asked. That consistency should have been reassuring, but it only made my unease deepen. By the following evening, the building manager mentioned that maintenance had been asked to check the plumbing in Mason's unit. Apparently, a neighbor below complained about unusual noises in the pipes during the night of the argument. I watched from my doorway as two maintenance workers went in with tool bags and came out quieter than they'd gone in. One of them wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, just shook his head slightly when the manager whispered something to him. Shortly after, the police arrived again, this time with gloves and sealed evidence bags. The air in the hallway felt thicker, like the walls were listening. Mason was escorted out, hands free but flanked closely, his face still calm in that unsettling way. As he passed me, he gave a quick nod, the same polite gesture he always used, and it made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, sleep was impossible again, but for different reasons. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors sharing fragments of what they'd heard from friends or overheard in stairwells. Someone mentioned phone records showing Lily's last call ended minutes after the door closed. Another said the security footage had been manually accessed around the same time, something only residents could do with the right code. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every sound from that night, wondering which ones I'd dismissed too quickly. The argument, the thud, the silence, all of it rearranged itself into something darker the more I thought about it. It struck me how normal the evening had felt before the shouting started, how easily a life could slip sideways without warning. Knowing I'd been just a wall away made the memory cling to me in an uncomfortable, personal way. The resolution came quietly, without the dramatic announcements people expect. Weeks later, the building received a brief notice confirming Mason had been charged, and that Lily's disappearance was no longer considered voluntary. Details were scarce, but Enough leaked to confirm what most of us already suspected about what happened after that door closed. Life in the complex returned to its routine, new tenants moved in, and conversations shifted to safer topics. Still, every now and then I catch myself listening too closely to the hallway at night, counting footsteps and door clicks. That careful sound of the lock turning has stayed with me more than the shouting ever did. It taught me how thin the line is between overhearing an argument and witnessing the beginning of something irreversible. Even now, thinking back on that day, it's the small details that refuse to fade. The way the hallway light flickered slightly after the door shut, like it hesitated. The smell of someone's burned dinner drifting through the vents minutes later, absurdly normal. I remember standing in my kitchen that morning, coffee going cold in my hands, staring at the wall we shared and trying to convince myself I was overthinking everything. Part of me wanted to believe Mason's version because it was easier, because it let the night stay contained. Accepting the alternative meant admitting I'd been close to something final and hadn't done a thing. That realization carried a quiet guilt that settled deep and stayed there. I replayed every choice I made during that night. Every moment I decided to stay put instead of stepping into the hall. It wasn't bravery that stopped me, just routine, the unspoken rule that you don't involve yourself in other people's messes. Friends I talked to later said the same thing. They wouldn't have done anything either. Still, that didn't make it easier to live with. The knowledge that Lily's last moments likely happened feet away from me turned the apartment into something unfamiliar. Sounds carried differently after that, each muffled noise charged with meaning. I started keeping my TV louder at night, not for entertainment, but to drown out the building itself. Eventually I moved out, not dramatically, just a lease ending and a quiet decision not to renew. On my last day there, I stood in the empty hallway for a moment, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. Mason's unit was sealed and dark, a small notice still taped crookedly to the doorframe. New people would eventually live there, unaware of what had unfolded behind those walls. I wondered if they'd ever sense it the way the air seemed heavier around that door. Leaving didn't erase the memory, but it gave it boundaries, a place I could point to and say, that happened there, not here. What stays with me most isn't fear, but awareness. That night taught me how ordinary horror can look until it's already finished. No warning signs flashing, no clear moment where intervention feels obvious. Just raised voices, a door closing, and a story that almost worked. I still think about Lily sometimes, about how easily she vanished from everyone's daily routine before the truth surfaced. Sharing this now isn't about closure, because I don't think that ever really arrives. It's about not letting that silence be the final thing remembered.